Today, let's go through some tips and tricks for sewing with stretch satin. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are talking about stretch satin. So stretch satin is an amazing fabric, especially for gowns, for higher end apparel, for really nice accessories, but it can be difficult to work with. So today we are going to be talking about some tips and tricks for working through it, some little ideas so that when you start working with it, it'll be much easier and you won't run into too many issues. Now, stretch satin actually comes in a lot of different weights. As you can see here, I have a thicker weight stretch satin, but it also can come in thinner weights too, so it really just depends. As you also can see, it does fray. So stretch satin is a fabric that frays. You are going to want to figure out a way to finish off your edges. So this could be with a serger, an overlock stitch, or this could be using zigzag scissors. There's a lot of different ways that you could finish this off so that you don't have these little fraying fabric all along the edges. And you will want to think about making sure you're doing some sort of rolled hem or just a hem that is fully enclosed to help with the fraying as well. Now, when it comes to actually working with the stretched satin, right, if we're pinning it, sometimes pins work. So there are specific pins for satin. They are a little thinner. Sometimes these pins that you may have, your regular pins, are too thick, and this will actually damage your fabric. So instead of using a pin, if you just want it to be safe, you could definitely opt for something like quilting clips or wonder clips, because this is not actually going to be going through your fabric. It's just holding it in place. Now, because stretched satin is very thin on occasion, the clips may not work the best for it, and that's where you can start to look into very specific like satin pins that are much thinner and won't affect your fabric as much. Now, in addition, when we are sewing with this, you may want to look into something that is like a walking foot. So a walking foot has, on their sewing machine, you have those like feed dogs at the bottom, and the walking foot has this on top as well. So as your stitches and the needle goes in and out, the dogs on the top help move the fabric through from the top as well as the bottom. So this is especially important for the stretch satin as it has stretch one way. So if your needle and your presser foot were not correct, this will actually stretch out and you're going to get a garment that doesn't look too good. So definitely recommend something like a walking foot, but since a walking foot is a little heavier, it is more expensive. You could also opt for something like a knit foot. So a knit foot is basically just the smaller, more compact version of a walking foot. It has the same idea where it has this ability to push fabric from the top as well as from the bottom. So it's going to give you that same effect, but it's just a much smaller option. And I'll be sure to include links to these in case you are interested in finding out more. Now, once we have our presser foot all set up and we have it all pinned or clipped, next you want to worry about your needle. So you specifically, if you're using stretch fabric, want to use a ballpoint needle. Now, depending on the weight of your fabric, if it's very thin, you're going to want to use a smaller size needle, so a smaller number. If you're using this medium weight to thicker, you could probably get away with a bigger needle. So it's always important to test out some fabric first to see which needle is going to work best for your fabric. Now, when it comes to actual stitch length, sometimes if you are using a very thin fabric, you may want to reduce that stitch length slightly. This will just help it from puckering while you're sewing. So I have my fabric here, I have everything set up, and what I'm actually going to do first is just use a regular presser foot and just take a straight seam. Now, for this one stitch, it's not too bad. It is able to go through. I have my fabric, but as you can see, that was just going on the direction where it didn't have any stretch. So now if I do that exact same thing where I'm just taking a straight stitch using my regular presser foot, what I have now is it's sewed through it, but if I try to stretch the fabric, the seam is actually going to snap, and that is because it was that straight seam, there was no give to it. So if you are using this fabric, especially a stretch material, be sure that you use some sort of stretch stitch, such as a lightning stitch or a zigzag stitch, as this is going to give your fabric movement. It's going to allow your fabric to stretch, and you won't have to worry about that seam breaking. Now, as you can see here, I have just been using this regular presser foot, and in this instance, and when I start to do those two layers, it does make it slightly harder to sew through both of these layers at the same time, especially given that it has that stretch. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to be using my knit foot. As you can see here, it looks a little different. It was much easier to sew through this. The fabric was able to move through a lot smoother. We have a really nice stitch without needing to use a walking foot. Now, of course, you can use a walking foot. Here, I was actually taking a hem on this dress for one of the sleeves, and for this the walking foot came so much in handy just because it was a lot of fabric. So as you can see here, this is sort of what some of the stitches look like for that stretch satin. Everything comes out really nicely when you're using the correct needle, the correct techniques, as well as the correct presser foot. Now, last but not least, when it comes to pressing and ironing, you're going to really want to test this out on your own fabric, so the fabric that you get. Some stretch satin is able to handle heat pretty well, others you are going to want it at a very low setting, and maybe using a pressing cloth to help make sure that you are not burning your fabric. When I was working with this heavier weight stretch satin, I found that it actually held up pretty well to heat, but I kept it at a lower setting just to be sure that I didn't damage my fabric in any sort of way. So be sure to test that out when you are working with your own fabric. Let me know your tips and tricks for working with stretch satin, and thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.